special live where I'm going to be interviewing Lara Rathod on Hey. So she'll be joining me shortly, and we are going to talk about everything from racism to colorism to feminism. She is of South Asian descent, but living in the UK. So I'm really excited for this intersectional, cross-cultural, international conversation that we're about to have. And it's actually really cool because I started the week on Monday on a panel for South Asian Heritage Month in the UK. And now I'm ending the week talking to a South Asian woman living in the UK, right? And so one of the things from that panel that I was really excited about was having and continuing cross-cultural conversations, right? Talking about xenophobia about in the US, talking about anti-Blackness in places around the globe, right? And so I'm excited to have the second conversation of the week with a South Asian woman talking about the issues that impact all of us, right? How are y'all doing? Thanks everyone for coming in. We have a lot of people hopping on, which is really, really exciting. Be sure to leave your comments. We'll try to save some room for questions. Mind. And periodically, if you leave a comment, I'll try to read them out as well as they pertain to the topic. Hello, Lara, how are you?
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
Good. So it's already evening where you are, but I'm glad you made time to do this interview. I'm really excited about it.
Me too.
Yeah.
I'm more of a night owl anyway.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and I'm a morning person. So we were actually talking about that this morning. So I want to get started as soon as we can. I'm going to set a timer because Instagram does cut us off right at 60 seconds. But I want to start by reading your bio, okay?
Okay, cool.
So Lara Rathod is a speaker, thought leader, creator, writer, and activist. She left in an 18-year corporate law career and position as head of legal in London to pursue work which meaningfully impacts others. Lara's why is to use her voice consciously so that people are inspired to affect change in themselves, their life, and the world. She created and hosts the Red Sofa Conversations, whose mission is to delve into topics that connect us as humans to show that we are more alike than different. Her other series include a 77-part series called the Corona Diaries, in which she speaks about issues affecting women, but also life challenges that affect us all. She was currently working on a series on racism. She believes that it is absolutely essential for all people, especially women, to find and use their voice. All right. So I know we were talking just before this live, and you mentioned from one of our previous conversations that you had a snippet of something that you wanted to share before we got into the conversation. So I'll let you share that now.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. So I want to share this. I wrote this last month in the context of an incident of racism that I endured, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I wanted to set the tone for why it's so important for all of us to be having these kinds of conversations. And while what I'm reading is particular to racism, it can be applied to colorism and equality, feminism and equality as well. So these are uncomfortable conversations, I know, and they can bring up feelings that are painful to experience. But this much I know for sure. In order to create deep, meaningful, lasting change in the world, we need to unearth the dark, distasteful cancer that lies within us as individuals, within families, within communities, within workplaces, within society. That is the only way we can dismantle the systemic racism that exists and eradicate the deep-rooted conditioning within all of us, especially within people who are not even able to acknowledge their own behavior as racist.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So that was well written. And I can't wait for the audience to get the context behind that and the impetus behind you writing that. But I think we'll start with you telling us a little bit about your background. I know you have a unique set of experiences that I think helps to inform us about how these things have nuance depending on not only our ethnic background, but our location in the world, etc.
Yeah, I think they really do, and I think that what these conversations are proving is that no one race or no one color of people are a monolith. Everybody is going to have different experiences depending on where they grew up, depending on, you know, the cultures that they were raised in, the environments that they find themselves in. So I was born in England, and when I was 3, myself and my parents, we moved to Bahrain in the Middle East. So I was raised primarily in Bahrain, and I was there from age 3 to age 12. And then we moved to Istanbul, where I was there for 1 year. And then I moved back to the UK, where I was in boarding school for 6 months. And then finally, London, where I've been for 31 years. So I finished off my schooling in London and then did university and law school and worked in London. And so, yeah, I'm a third culture kid. And when I was reflecting about this, I've always thought that being a third culture kid just made me more open to, you know, all nationalities and all races and all people, because I had such a varied upbringing. But what it actually did is, which I only just realized, you know, that in the last few days, is that because I was sort of the other. So when I moved to Bahrain, I wasn't Bahraini. I came from England. England was my home because I was born here. And so I wasn't Bahraini. Then I went to primarily to a British school, and I was primarily, you know, in the minority. And so I wasn't white. I knew I was Indian and brown, but I was Christian. I was raised Christian. I'm more spiritual now. My parents were Christian, so I didn't speak an Indian language because my parents came from 2 different places. So English was the language of the home. Being Christian, I didn't celebrate, you know, traditionally Indian festivals like Diwali. And so I always, I guess not consciously, but I was the other. And what that did is it made me think of myself as an individual. So think of myself as Lara. And it also made me see other people as individuals and not representatives of their race or their country or their nationality. And I think that that's a really unique perspective, which I'm really grateful for, because that's sort of, you know, deep in my psyche. That's sort of my view of the world. So yeah, that's how I didn't have, you know, a traditional South Asian upbringing. And so there's certain elements, you know, especially colorism. While I had incidents of racism when I was younger, and, you know, as an adult, in terms of colorism, it was more as an adult. And actually the first time I became even aware of, and not colorism as a term, because it's actually a relatively new term for me, I became aware of that, I was 20. So in terms of sort of incidents of racism, you know, I don't think I'm unique in this. I think everybody who is hearing this will have, you know, endured or witnessed or suffered things very, very similar. So, you know, you've got the standard, and when I'm using humor, I'm not meaning to diminish, because the fact that I can still remember all of these incidents, and I'm 45, really goes to show how when you're in them and when you're experiencing them, they pierce really deep. And, you know, they do leave a lasting impact on you. So I've had my skin ate compared to poo, which is, you know, a term of racism which endures to this day. So clearly people haven't come up with more inventive things. When I was in boarding school, I was actually told by somebody I shared a room with, there were 5 of us in a room, get your N-word hairs off my bed.
Wow.
And I was like, you know, I was sort of in shock that someone would say something that was blatantly incorrect, but also would say something that was blatantly rude, you know? And then, you know, in London, I've actually been fortunate. I haven't endured a lot of, you know, direct sort of overt racism, but I have been told on a few occasions to F off, you packy, go home. Again, ignorance, because all brown people are not from the same place, but also go home. You know, I find that what do you call that? Is that a racial epithet, Sarah? Yeah,
Yeah.
I find that it's such a lazy thing to say. You know, it's so untrue, unkind, uneducated, and it's really insulting. You know, I kind of, my response to that was factual. Well, I was born here, you know, like there's nowhere for me to go.
Right.
So yeah, those were the issues. Those were sort of the historic incidents of racism. And then in terms of colorism, I remember watching a film which I looked up. It was a miniseries that came out in 1987, and it was about an Indian girl who was very white, and she was revered for her beauty. And then she moved to England, and then I think became a famous film star, Adorn Avalon. So the series is called Queenie. And I remember when I watched Queenie, while I acknowledged that she was Indian, the actress that played her was Mia Sara, which is the girlfriend in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and she's Italian. And so while where the premise of the story was that, you know, when she became famous, she hid her roots. And so I knew that was, I guess, my first introduction into colorism, but I didn't even take it as mine because I so distinguished her from me. She aligned with the white standard of beauty that I had, you know, absorbed and been conditioned, because, you know, that's, you know, the people that fancy people in school were the slim white girls, you know. Then, you know, on TV and books, you know, how many years on, 26 or probably a bit more than that, 30 years on, I can literally still remember the descriptions of the Sweet Valley twins, you know, 110, 5 foot,
Yes.
eyes, sun-kissed blonde hair. So that was the standard of beauty.
Yes.
So I didn't really think of myself in reference to her. I thought of her as, oh, she's beautiful because she's white. And so when I was 20 or nearly 20, and I went to India after an 11-year gap, that was my first real introduction into colorism, because I hadn't been raised in that traditional South Asian culture. And a family member, a male family member of the generation above, hadn't seen me since age 9 and looked at me and said, well, she's rather beautiful, even though she's very dark.
Yeah.
And I honestly, I can close my eyes and I can literally remember the scene, because I felt like I had been shot. I both for being really beautiful, because I never thought of myself as beautiful until I was in my 20s, and then people started saying it, and I kind of started to reframe, oh, maybe I am. But also being dark, because he was darker than me. And I remember at the time thinking, but what's that got to do with anything? You know, like, I don't understand. And I didn't know, you know, I was very naive, and I didn't know at all what big business the whitening industry is. It's $1 billion business. And I've been reading a lot more into it now with the pressure on Fair and Lovely, and other companies. And while Johnson & Johnson have taken products off the market, Fair and Lovely, Unilever, is literally renaming Fair and Lovely Glow and Lovely. Plus, I thought, I only thought it was just Fair and Lovely. I didn't know that other brands were making that. This was specific, like Pond's and Lotus Herbals, and I didn't know this. And so, yeah, like, I just remember seeing ads in my, I guess when I was 21, when I went back to Bahrain, and seeing the ads of Fair and Lovely on the TV and asking my parents what they said, because they were in Hindi. And it was basically something about, you know, your husband, you'll get a husband, and you'll get to keep a husband if you're fairer. And I just remember at that point going, well, that's ridiculous. So, you know, I wasn't sort of hit by colorism, I think, in the way that I've heard you describe. You know, I didn't have a sibling who was a different, I'm an only child. My cousins, you know, pretty much same color as me. So yeah, like, I just didn't have that element of being compared. And So when we talk about the incident of racism, it's quite interesting with there, because I wasn't aware of the term colorism, but when I describe what happened, I see, and other people pointed out, that colorism was used to actually deny me from speaking up against
Yeah.
race,
I
which
think it's interesting when you talk about the phrase "go home," how there's like an interesting combination of both the racism and the xenophobia, right? And it's
yeah,
in the UK that probably means something different than it does in the US, because in the US it's even more absurd to say that, because the people who say that aren't from, their ancestors were not from here either, so it's like
I know,
double layers of like
it's a
incorrect.
difference. Yeah,
Yeah. But I also hear what you're saying. I'm glad that you know, pointed out that difference, right? And how, why some of us might be experiencing colorism and be really aware of it and conscious of it and hurt by it at younger ages because of like a greater diversity in skin tones within a family, or because we live in a community, right, where there are a lot of people of the same race. And
to
so when you
compare.
have
Yeah,
racial homogeny, then you can really understand colorism, right? Because race becomes less of the focus, right? So yeah, I think that's a good explanation as to why, you know, living in the UK and going to British schools, the racism was more of the salient point at the time, and then going back to India, you were exposed to some of it as well. And definitely, like with the bleaching creams, it's not just a billion dollars, but it's like multiple billions of dollars, which
it is.
is
Is it 400
insane.
billion? It's some insane number. I mean,
Yes.
when I
Yeah.
read, and I did not realize how pervasive and
Mm-hmm.
prevalent it was, not just in South Asia, but also in, you know, in the Far East and everything. I really had
Mm-hmm.
no idea. And so
Yeah.
it's a massive issue, because it's not just a, oh, the proximity to whiteness makes you more, in quotes, beautiful, intelligent, morally good. But it's also these creams have very harmful ingredients and are doing
Exactly.
terrible things
Exactly.
to people,
Yes.
all in the name of an archetype of beauty, which
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, as women, and we'll come on to this as
Mm-hmm.
well, as
Mm-hmm.
women, you know, everybody, you know, society feels like they know how we as a monolith should be,
Mm-hmm.
should look like, should act like.
Yeah.
And this is all when I think when we have conversations about racism, colorism, feminism, I think you can't separate it out. And we have to talk about when we're speaking up against one thing, in reality, we're speaking up against every marginalized group. And we're saying that we want people to be treated for who they are and not for what they are, where they're from, what they look like, right?
Right. And I think too, like even when you were describing like the Sweet Valley Kids books, I remember that so much. But also when you mentioned the white girls at the boarding school, and you said that they were slender white girls, right? And so for you, like that was also one of the features that set them, you know, apart as like the so-called standard of beauty. And then again, talking about the gender dynamic, the fact
Yeah.
that, you know, your male relative could be darker than you. I hope my connection is still good. That your male relative could be darker than you, but still be in a position to judge you for your, you know, attractiveness or beauty, right? And you, I don't know, like are female members of the family, you know, also able to say, well, you won't get a wife because you're too dark, or you know, it's a
Never.
shame, you could be so much more handsome if you were lighter, you know? Yeah.
There's no such thing as reverse racism, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm wondering, and you can, you know, add in as you feel like, but do you want to go ahead and give a little bit of background about the more recent instance of racism that you were talking about?
Yeah. Okay. So the that I'm choosing to focus in this one, twofold. One, because of the context in which it was set in, because we can have a lot of conversations and, you know, incidents of racism, and one could be forgiven if you're, oh, well, that's what people did then, but, you know, people are more educated now, people are more aware now, people are more sensitive now, right? So that's why I'm picking this incident to talk about,
Right.
because it's so relevant. And not only is it so relevant, as in it's happened in the last 2 months, it actually happened on Blackout Tuesday, which was the 2nd of June. And it was when everybody was posting Black. And that week was Share the Mic Now. The week after George Floyd had been murdered, and the whole world was talking about racism, the need for change. You know, these were conversations that were happening literally across the whole world. And the other reason that I want to talk about it is that it is emblematic and symbolic of conversations and events that happen in every country and in every single arena and in, you know, every single kind of group. So it's not a particularly nuanced event. So shall I just kick off and describe it?
Yes.
Yeah, Sarah?
Yes.
Yeah. So the incident happened on a video call where I was the only person of color, which I never normally notice these things at all, but I did notice it for reasons that will become obvious. There were 9 of us on the call, and what happened was that a white male said that basically he denied that.
So you're breaking up a little bit.
And when I responded, and am I breaking up? Oh, this happened on the last live.
Yeah, and I think there's a delay, and then it like buffers a little.
Okay, if it happens again, I'll switch. Okay, so complained about how awful it was to be a white man. So, and nobody on the call
I can't hear you. So I think you lost sound. Can you say something? Let me see if I can hear you. No, I don't hear you at all now. So before you were like buffering. Do you want to exit the call and then I can add you back in? All right, folks. So thanks for hanging in there with us. We're going to see if she can exit and come back in. Hello? No? Okay, let me try this. So I'm going to X you out, and then you can request to join. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you. Now I'm just pretty. All right, so we're gonna try to get her back on, which means, there we go. Okay, let's try to reconnect, y'all. Good looking out, folks. Gotta watch that audio. Hopefully it'll refresh now. Hello. Okay.
Hi. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I need to get onto my Wi-Fi company because this happened before, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm paying super fast broadband, so this is not okay. I'm really sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, what did you get?
So I got, and I don't know if the audience wants to start at a particular spot, but I got that there was a person on the video call of about 9 people who was denying the fact that racism existed and talking about how difficult it was to be a white man.
Yeah, yes. And saying that, you know, what happened to George Floyd had nothing to do with the color of his skin. And while I responded and I tried to, you know, I'd never actually encountered anybody who denied it existed. So I kind of just was like, well, you know, it exists because I have experienced it. I figured rather than talk about, you know, society, I'll just go personal and say I've experienced it. And I saw that I wasn't getting through. And so the conversation moved on and other people started to speak. And quite honestly, I would not even have said anything. I would have just put it down to, oh, one ignorant person. If what then happened was that I couldn't make eye contact with anybody on the call for the rest of the call, the 40 minutes. I felt ashamed. I was in shock. I felt deeply uncomfortable. I felt like I didn't belong. And I felt like, on one hand, it was familiar, which was really troubling because I did not know why this feeling was familiar. But also it was so unexpected on this type of call with socially conscious people. And it was a call because we were all representatives of an organization that espouses values of, you know, diversity and solidarity and unity and, you know, acceptance, and how it's codified at all levels of the organization. And we've all received training about how to be, you know, better empathetic listeners and, you know, more accepting of, you know, all people and all of that, right? So it was the shock. And after myself early, okay, am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. When I got off the call, I realized that what I'd experienced was racism. I burst into tears. I was devastated.
Hello? Are we good?
Yeah, I can hear.
Okay. So it's still buffering. I can hear you
Okay,
now.
I keep seeing. Okay. So in a message in the private chat, where I explained what had happened, I explained why that wasn't okay, I explained, you know, how that made me feel, and I set a boundary saying that I couldn't be on further calls. And that would have been very easy because actually he was a different representative, so they could have easily split the calls, which had literally only just been merged. And what happened after is why it makes this incident so such an unbelievable teaching incident, because everything that happened after showed me that we have a real inability to deal with people speaking up about racism. Because not only did I, you know, personally endure gaslighting and shaming and reprimanding and, you know, invalidating and all of those kinds of things, but I found that people were not able to even acknowledge that behavior as being racism, and wanted to fast forward to me forgiving and moving on and not making it about a fight between right and wrong, and telling me that nobody's experience of life. And I was like, I couldn't understand it. And so I sent a second message, because I was still at this point, I knew I didn't need to educate, but I felt out of respect for the organization and for the people, I felt like if I just explain it. So that message, first message took
right.
5 hours. The second message took me 9 hours because I was very careful about how I wrote it, because I know that when you're writing these things, you know, you kind of have to get the tone right, especially when you're putting something in writing, because you know you're not saying it, so people can't hear your tone. So I sent the second message, and I started getting, you know, passive aggressive memes of, you know, people using their voice in anger, and it coming to, you know, come back against them. And then people were spiritually bypassing me and asking me, why was my inner child triggered, and what does that say about me? And it's all about me and my feelings, and nothing about anybody, and nothing about the actual situation. And the only reason, you know, I felt sort of that I could speak up was because I felt this was racism 101. It wasn't a racial slur, a nuanced racial slur about me that somebody could go, oh, well, you're just like taking it the wrong way. This was forward denial that racism existed. And so I thought, well, if there's any time to speak up about it where people understand, because this is all anybody is talking about, it is now. And so I was not prepared at all with the onslaught of what I faced. And only one person in a 16-person chat acknowledged it as responses, some of which I've mentioned, but, you know, I got the love and Rachel Cargill talks about this, isn't it? She's got a famous quote. She says, I don't want your love. Or what does Rachel Cargill say, Sarah? Something about, I don't want your love or and action. I have no time for passive empathy. All of these, oh, you know, we love you, we care about you. I was experiencing a cognitive dissonance between some telling me they love me and about me and they hear me, but then they're not actually acknowledging what's happened. They're not really that. And I was having to piece all of this together in a traumatic situation, because of course enduring this had triggered all of these other instances that were racism. But I recognized the feeling, and I realized in my 20 in you know, the corporate sector in London, I realized, wow, I've experienced this before. In my racism series is about how racism, because it really is trauma.
It is. So you're buffering, so that's why I'm pausing to make sure that I don't cut you off prematurely. So with that incident, I kind of appreciate your vulnerability for sharing that incident, first of all. And I've been watching the comments as you've been explaining it. People are shocked, as you were, right? Rightfully so. Like, it is shocking that in 2020 someone would deny that racism is even a thing, especially if they're supposedly part of one of the woker or like more seemingly progressive institutions. I think that's part of what's so triggering, right? If we were at a Trump rally and we heard people saying racism is not a thing, we'd be like, oh yeah, okay. But when you think that you're with your people, and to hear that and experience that, I think says a lot, right? And I also think it's interesting that this was a white man, right? And so people were not holding this man accountable, right, for talking over a woman of color, denying her reality, her truth, right? Even if he didn't think it was systemically a problem, it's still wrong for him to say that your experiences and observations and perspectives are false, right? And so I'm wondering if you could elaborate on how you see the gender dynamic, especially being a woman, but a woman of color, and having it being assumed that you were just hurting, you're just being too sensitive, or you're just the angry brown woman, you know what I mean? And how that influenced the way everyone else in the group or the community responded.
everything was okay up until this point. You know, I felt very much a part of the organization. As well.
Yeah.
I'm pausing for buffering, so I'm not.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that you can see it, because we do want to hear as much of what you say as we can.
Yeah. So accused of bringing anger and hatred into this beautiful group, as if it was me. I was the one. And I think that, you know, this is part of the problem that we'll get into when we start talking about women and feminism. But just to round off, like, this particular situation, to the lead, had real belief in his integrity, in you know, my interactions with him and everything he stood for. So I thought, if there's anybody that's going to understand this, it will be him. And then the leader sets the tone. And what was the most shocking thing of all, apart from the fact that, you know, seeing friends turn on me, is that when I did escalate it, and I escalated that in a private Facebook group, because that was the only way of getting them to him, his response was that he is focused on anti-Blackness, that as a person of color, I don't experience the same degree of racism as a Black person, and he will fight racism his way by focusing on racism. And I was floored. And then he went on to allude to things that, you know, 160 people in the group would have no idea that I had, but he made it seem like I had accused people of being racists and wanted them cast out, neither of which I had said in my 2 previous messages, which were in a private chat. So only, you know, 16 people knows. So the rest, so he basically maligned me as well. And when I saw that, I was honestly devastated. But it opened my eyes. I was dealing with. I took a couple of days to heal, or not to heal, days to rest, because I'd been like literally getting 3 hours sleep for 3 nights, absolutely exhausted. And I didn't want to make a reactive decision, but the decision that I then made was that I couldn't allow myself an organization that didn't share my values, and an organization that was clearly performative, where there was, you know, a real absence of morally courageous leadership, which is what I think we need. And the fact that I've been dismissed completely because I happened to bring up racism in that week, it was just racism, and so even going to hear you. So the whole experience was very shocking. Is that if I, who had 8, these values are enshrined,
So I think I might have missed the end of that.
have I frozen?
I do. So it's buffering a little bit, but I see that you've paused. So I want to be conscious of time. We have about 20 minutes left. So I do want to get more into an explicit conversation about feminism and how you think feminism helps us deal with issues like colorism and racism and sexism, and how it can be a tool, as you said, for tackling multiple forms of oppression. Since we have 20 minutes left, because I want to talk more about feminism, but I also want to talk about how you cope with the trauma and the trigger and the burden of experiencing racism like that, right? Like those feelings of shame and gaslighting. But I want to kind of end with that discussion. So before we get there, let's pull out the thread of feminism a little bit more explicitly, and how you see feminism playing a role in 2020 in terms of tackling multiple forms of oppression, or just other thoughts that you have on how it's relevant to, you know, your story.
I think that a really great parallel is how people report on when women speak up. So in my incident, obviously it wasn't reported. However, I think that the fact that I was a woman raising it, I do think that plays a part, because in other incidences, when I've been working in corporate, I've seen a direct parallel between myself raising an issue, and not an issue about this, but literally a logistical issue that needs to be solved, that involves something, you know, being done. And, you know, the way that I write those emails, where I'm like, dear so-and-so, I'd be grateful if you could, I will let you know, I'll update you, please let me know, you know, kind regards, to a man writing a shorter, no dear, no whatever, just, you know, so-and-so, do this, and then his name. And I've seen literally in the space of 5 minutes, the direct comparison between how received. And my response was, no, we can't do anything about that, to, okay, I'll look into it. So I'm pretty sure from that it plays a part. And I think that when you have women speaking up and about anything, like anything that affects them, or anything that they have experienced which they don't feel is okay, I think that the patriarchy wants to silence women. And a perfect example of that is how Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez has been, how her story has been reported. So I don't know the percentage, but there's been a lot of positive press about it. But there has also been some press using language like AOC went off against Head Yoho. That was Now Politics made a little video, and that was how they captioned it. And I actually commented saying, this is inappropriate, and you are perpetuating, it's irresponsible because you're perpetuating the trope of the angry, crazy woman, which is not true. She was dignified, eloquent, and graceful. Then in the press, people have accused her of using it to further her brand. Then when before she made her speech, when it was reported about what he said, they didn't use the phrase. But when speech, and they reported on it, they said that he called her an effing B. And so, you know, you have to wonder.
Yeah.
You have to wonder, when you look at the nuances, which I've been, you know, I've been a lot more aware of in the last, you know, 3-4 years, how all of these things are very subtle, and until somebody points something out to you, you might not realize it. But then once you see it once, I'm telling you, you cannot unsee it.
Right.
It is everywhere. It's literally everywhere. And yeah, like I've seen a lot of irresponsible media reporting,
and I
you know,
think,
not just about.
I think that's why people are afraid to look at it initially. And I think that's why, because when you do, when the veil is lifted, it can be overwhelming at just how prevalent it is, how that it is everywhere. And so people like try to pull down that veil and like keep it there, so that, because, you know, they see obliviousness as being bliss, right? But yeah, continue.
Yeah, it can be really overwhelming. I definitely feel, since George Floyd was murdered, and where I've been educating myself a lot in the last, you know, 7-8 weeks, and learning about all of this, I definitely feel like the illusion shattering about how far we've come, you know, as a society.
Right.
But also, you know, I was a really proud Londoner, and I was like, okay, I know that, you know, the UK hasn't been great because of Brexit, unleashed the underbelly. So, you know, we lost our standing a little bit about how progressive we were in the world. But I was like, but London voted Remain. London is international and diverse, and I love London. I'm not knocking it. However, I do think that we all need to take responsibility and really look at you know, where at the situations and events that are happening all around us in our backyards, and realize that this is not, as one, you know, news reporter in the UK tried to get George the poet to say, oh, this is an America problem, the UK is amazing. And I remember like watching that clip going, I don't think we're amazing. And now a lot of people are coming out saying exactly the same thing. Yeah. So, you know, we all have a collective responsibility to do something. And I think that when you were talking about the healing and how traumatic it is hugely traumatic. And so I'm a speaker. I had literally, before this incident, I'd literally made videos towards the end of the Corona Diaries about using your voice, how important it is, how you can do it. Yeah. I'd said, you know, everybody in any situation, you just need to say, this is not okay. I gave people language. I did a video about Let's Talk Racism. I said, you know, I've been very, privileged because I haven't endured the consistent racism that some people have. And I pointed them to resources and encouraged them to speak up. And then I was in a situation where I was completely blindsided. Yep. And I found I couldn't speak up because I didn't even know what was happening. Yes. And so I understand. Yes. I understand how difficult it is.
And I want to pause on that. I know you have more to say, but I want to give a little breather so that the people watching can process what you're saying as well. All right. So I just want to reiterate, you were blindsided. And it was happening to you in the moment, and you didn't even realize what had happened until the moment passed. How many people on this call have had that same exact feeling, right? I know I have, you know, and like, you know, it feels wrong in the moment, but you don't know what it is until a few seconds, a few minutes, sometimes days or weeks later. That like, yo, like they were really racist towards me. And then I think that speaks to the necessity of true allies, the necessity of true allyship, right? So you being a woman of color in that moment, if there had been a white person or, you know, a man on the call who could recognize it, and because they were not experiencing the trauma, had the, you know, I think wherewithal to speak up on your behalf, that makes all the difference, right? And so I think, you know, for all the people who want to be allies by reading books, who want to be allies by sharing stuff on social media, that's, I mean, yeah, do that to educate yourself, but where we actually need you is in these conference rooms, on these Zoom calls, in these classrooms, right? And like, have the wherewithal when that person of color is like experiencing, is like being traumatized. Because when you're being re-traumatized, you don't always have your wits about you, you know, to speak up articulately in the moment.
Yeah. And, you know, in social groups, social gatherings, dinner tables, family conversations, you know, like these are you start small. Like nobody has to make videos. I choose to do it and to educate because I feel like it's something that I can do and I want to do. But really, in order to tackle this, it would be wonderful if everybody started small. Yeah. And yes, we need more than performative allyship. You know, you know how people say love is a verb? Ally is a verb.
Yes. Yes.
Ally is a verb. You can't call yourself an ally if you stay silent, because if you stay silent, in the words of Desmond Tutu, you know, you're siding with the oppressor.
Yes.
And you know, it's not okay. Like, that's the only way that change can be created. It's a ripple effect, because the more people don't find jokes funny,
Right.
and the more people are willing to lose their social capital of just, laughing at a joke because everybody's laughing.
Right.
It takes guts. Like, make no mistake, I think it takes the same amount of guts as going skydiving or bungee jumping, because it feels like you're on a cliff edge when you say something.
Yes.
And it's true.
Yeah.
So that's why I would like to think, after what I've been through, that if I was in another similar situation, I'd be able to speak up at, in that moment. I'd like to think that now I'm so much more aware. I'm continuing to educate myself, but who knows, because it's traumatic.
It is.
And that's why you're right, Sarah. We really do need allies. And I like the fact that allyship is being talked about now, because certainly I didn't even know it was a thing. I didn't know, I was like, what's an ally? Oh, why would somebody do that? Why would somebody go, that's not okay? Because when things have happened to me before, I've literally been in a corporate environment, all of us sitting around having dinner, 15 people, and one person has gone, what's that smell, when I had brought curry from home and they were all having Thai. Oh, that's really strong. And I said, well, this is my mum's, home cooked food. Because, we'd been working consistently and ordering takeout for like 2 weeks, and I just needed something from home.
Right.
And I spoke up and said that little amount of, this is my mum's food, not one single person called the other person out. Not one person. There were 12 or 13 people around that table, and nobody did.
Right.
So, that's why these are deeply uncomfortable conversations, they're so necessary to have.
Yeah. And I know sometimes people are looking for like real practical solutions or like tangible action steps. But the reason why my first piece of advice is always to cultivate courage is because of everything you just said. Like, you can't take the action. You can't do the practical thing if you haven't like cultivated and practiced building up that courage muscle, right? And it does start in the smallest moments, right? We can't expect to, be out in society, like risking it all in the name of justice, if we are afraid in our living rooms, if we're afraid, in the bathroom, or, just whatever those smaller, more intimate places are, right? And so I think, and actually, if we're being honest with ourselves, sometimes those are the more courageous acts. Sometimes the intimate situations, the intimate dynamics require more courage than the public outward facing instances, because you're dealing with dynamics and relationships where there's more vulnerability, where there's history with that actual individual, with that person, right? Whereas when we're like in a protest or at a rally, we're dealing with strangers, people who may never see us again, right? So sometimes it is, among friends and family where the greater courage is actually required. We're getting close to time. So I would like to ask one more question before I ask for your, final overarching thoughts. So now that, you've had that experience and we're talking about dealing with that emotional weight, what is your plan or, path to healing for yourself, right? And like practicing some of those self-care moments. You talked about taking a couple of days off, right? But for the audience here, especially the people of color watching, or, just people who have experienced trauma, whether it's because of sexism or racism or homophobia or any sort of, form of oppression, dealing with that trauma after a specific instance, but also just day to day.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, because it's really important. So the couple of days I took wasn't to heal; it was just to rest. Because I felt like I was going to resign, but I didn't want to make a reactive decision.
Right.
The actual healing took me, I would say, about 6 weeks. I was experiencing chest pains and migraine, not sleeping. My sleeping still isn't great. and tiredness and fatigue and exhaustion and emotion, like I was crying, you know, like even after the fact, I couldn't believe it. So I gave myself that time, because once I recognized it's trauma, I've experienced trauma through grief before. So I realized, okay, I will give myself whatever time I need. I'm not going to put a clock on it. I'm not going to put requirements on it. I'm not going to pretend to be anything that I'm not. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm fine, or pretend that it didn't bother me.
Right.
I'm literally going to accept how I feel, because how I feel is valid and important, and it's how I feel, and full stop. Yes. So that was the first thing. I then created some boundaries.
Great.
And what I did was I was very sort of fueled to explain, you know, things, not within that situation, but then other things I saw online where people were saying things, you know, on my Facebook page. And so I wanted to sort of educate, because now these were people, you know, on my, you know, platform. And it was exhausting. Like, it was so depleting to keep going back and forth to explain basic things, that after I went through a week and a half of that, I decided, wow, I need to set another boundary, which is I'm not going to have these types of conversations with strangers or people that I'm not directly speaking to unless I choose to. So, and I'm not going to have what Nova Reid, who's an anti-racism activist in the UK, calls low-level basic conversations. So I'm not going to have a conversation trying to convince you that racism exists. You know, now there is so much information online. So much. You even have to Google a phrase and you'll get a whole history about it. So I'm not going to now also educate in the way that I was, you know, I thought I was like a one woman, I could, you know, do it all. But I realized, wow, you cannot change somebody's mind and heart. Somebody has to be curious enough and open enough to want to do that basic level work for themselves. And I've removed people from my sphere as well. You know, some people have been in my life 20 years. And once I saw the kinds of things that they were saying, and the fact that the level of defensiveness and the fact that they couldn't have a respectful conversation, I had to remove.
Are you back on?
Yeah, I'm back
on. So to recap, because I think these are very great strategies. First of all, you just rested. You weren't focused on healing per se, but you were just physically drained and depleted. So you took time to rest, right? And then what I hear you saying is that you set some boundaries. I feel like there was one other thing before the boundaries piece, but setting boundaries with your time. Oh, it was acknowledging how you felt. Right? So allowing yourself to just be in your genuine, honest feelings and emotions, giving yourself the space and the time to just cry and purge and, you know, vent and feel angry and hurt and sad. And then setting boundaries and recognizing when you need to set additional boundaries, right? And looking at, you know, even changing the relationships, maybe even eliminating some relationships in your life that contribute to your trauma, that contribute to those negative experiences. So I think that's very helpful. And I see some of the comments, a lot of people are saying, you know, you're a divine spirit and all your emotions are valid. Yes, boundaries. Spectrum of Salome. And they also say, I need to do that as well, right? That took strength, and I'm taking notes. Thank you for sharing, right? So thank you, Spectrum of Salome, for tuning in and taking notes, because this is valuable for all of us. And so in the last Hello, everyone. So it happened again. I was so enthralled with the conversation with Lara and the Instagram timer. Usually they put up like a 60-second warning or like a 15-second warning, and I didn't get that this time around. So it ended up kicking us out. But I'm going to bring Lara back on to say parting words and to let all of you know how you can follow and support her going forward into the future. Thank you for coming back, Asanda Malukani. I've seen you in the chat from the first session, so I appreciate your participation. And so as soon as Lara is able to rejoin, I'll just let her say parting words. I will say that what she was talking about just before, I think is extremely useful for people of color in particular dealing with instances of racism. It's useful for women dealing with instances of sexism, and how she took the time to rest. She recognized how she was feeling and allowed herself to feel that way, and then had to set boundaries, right? There we go. So here she is. She's coming on in just a second. There you go. Welcome back. So they kicked us out. Usually there's a 15-second timer that shows up, and it didn't pop up this time around. So, and then
it was so good that we were like,
exactly. And then when it kicked us out, I had to make sure to save it immediately, because if I did anything else, it would lose it forever, which is sad. You know, Instagram, you have to do better about saving people's lives. But I want to go ahead and let you, summarize your thoughts for this particular audience. This does not have to be our last conversation, of course. But for today, what would you like to leave the audience with? And also remind them of how they can follow you and, learn more about your work and support you in the future.
Thanks, Sarah. One thing that I did want to say about why boundaries are so important and why we have to protect ourselves is that there are some people that I think they treat it as some kind of weird debate.
Yes.
Where they want to start debating points with you to kind of score points.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done debating. Mm-hmm. Debating doesn't kind of attack your soul.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the reason why, especially people of color, need to protect themselves is that what other people might see as I'm debating and I'm going to show you why you're wrong, this is just re-triggering the trauma again and again and again, because in any situation, like in life, generally, you've got the thing that happened, and then you've got how the thing that happened is dealt with, right?
Yes.
And you can have something that's really big, but if it's dealt with well, there's healing that can come.
Yes.
Something that's really small,
mm-hmm.
but if it's dealt with really badly,
exactly,
then there's no healing.
Yep.
And in this incident itself, it was really big and it was dealt with badly.
Right.
Which universally, I accept it. I think that. But then, when it was in the Facebook group, there were some other people who were brave enough to vocalize what they felt about the whole situation and about the CEO's response.
Yeah.
So it's not a debate for us.
That's right.
It's incidents that have happened to us. It's incidents that have happened to family members, to friends, and it's incidents of trauma that have happened to people that are not even connected to us, mm-hmm. but they mirror things that we know have happened or have happened to people that we know. And it's very, very deeply painful. And so that's why setting boundaries, which is very hard for women to do, mm-hmm. Particularly mm-hmm. because women are expected to be selfless and give everybody and take care of everybody at the expense of ourselves. Right. That's why it's so important. And, hey, I'm not an expert on this. I started to set boundaries, just a few years ago. I'm 45. So, I went through most of my life without setting boundaries. So setting boundaries is pretty, relatively new.
Yeah. All right. So any other last thoughts, and then let the audience know, what you would like them to do in terms of supporting or following or sharing your work.
Last thoughts. What I really want people to do is in the quiet moments. They don't need to make a production out of it. They can just do it when they're, you know, going for a walk or traveling, you know, commuting to work, whatever. To start to examine your own thoughts and beliefs and biases. And if you can't even think of scenarios by yourself, then be aware of things that are happening and think of, oh, what's my instantaneous thought when I read that or when I saw that? And that will be a really good springboard to start understanding all of the conditioning, because I feel that the deep-rooted conditioning that's happened has happened to all of us, irrespective of race and skin color. It's just the degree. And some people are aware that there is conditioning. Some people are not aware at all. Some people are trying to do work to examine it and are curious. And some people want to deny it. And so that's how I would start. I would start with curiosity and, you know, examining it in the quiet moments, so that you're aware of yourself, and you can then, that's a springboard to be able to then take whatever small amount of action. Any tiny little action in any situation is better than nothing.
So, I love that. I love it. Asanda Malukani is saying it's hard for me to set boundaries because I'm a recovering people pleaser. I think we can all, you know, have experiences with that, right? But I'm getting better at setting boundaries because I get encouraged by how well people are responding to my boundaries. Yeah, like when you say no for the first time and nothing shatters, you're like, oh, I can say no again.
Go read some Brene Brown. She talks about she's very big about setting boundaries and how it actually will respect you more. Yeah,
Lara and I were just gushing over Brene Brown. We have a mutual love for Brene Brown. Thank you so much. I'm reading a comment. People are saying thank you for your vulnerability here. Having recently experienced racist, sexist aggression in an intimate personal context recently, this was so healing, right? I love that comment. That's a beautiful comment to end on. Thank you, Vashti Calvi. So we'll say, make sure you go and follow Lara for more of her great content. You can drop some Instagram handles and other handles, and then also in the comments. So when we post this video, we'll include her tags and things as well.
Yeah, so I'm on the usual platforms. Instagram, obviously, Lara London Speaks. I've got a YouTube channel, which is Lara Rathod. All the links to my social media are in my bio. And so you can see kind of talks that I've done, plus in my Instagram, there's different series. So there's the racism series, which is videos and posts, and then the Corona Diaries and Lara Reads, and on YouTube is the Red Sofa Conversations.
Yes. And for anyone watching, you should see 2 circles at the top of the screen. If you click on those circles, it'll take you right to Lara's page, right? So you don't have to like search it. You can just click her photo at the top of the screen now, and it'll say visit Lara London Speaks, and so you can follow her really easily that way. So thank you. This has been very encouraging for me and very inspiring, and I love connecting with women from around the world. And so I'm glad that, you know, we crossed digital paths, and then maybe after, you know, planes are flying again, you know, we can, you know, maybe take a trip. But let's do it again, and I hope to see you in the comments and sharing Lara's content in the future. Bye, everyone. Thank you.